Hi, I'm Brian.
And I'm Terry, and we welcome you to Queer Chat.
Yeah, it's another exciting week. And as y'all can see, we're in a different location. We're not in Pastor Matt's office today. We're in the church's conference room.
And so we don't have bookshelves behind us. I don't know if you've noticed, I've been putting books up on the shelf behind us.
Like a subliminal message, I think,
Right.
to spur some internal dialogue.
That's right. Or at least to make people think that Matt was reading them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are we talking about today, Terry?
Well, was it last Saturday night or the week before? It had been.
Yeah, it was a couple Saturdays ago.
Yeah.
We
watched a documentary from a streaming
Netflix
service.
Yeah, it's a Netflix documentary called Pray Away. And it basically followed the story of a person who at one point had lived life as a transgender woman.
Right.
And then
Jeffrey.
And then Jeffrey now claims to have been changed by God. So we look at sort of Jeffrey's narrative arc in the story, but then we also look at the changed movement, the Exodus movement, the ex-gay movement that was really popular in the late 80s and then kind of continuing on. And we heard stories from a lot of the people who were involved in the ex-gay movement. And they basically said that they were spewing lies at the time. They knew that it didn't work. And now they've come, and it's really sort of a video of atonement, I think, for many of them.
Yes, that's a good perspective. I like that.
So what was your general take on the movie, Terry?
I thought it seemed quite objective, although somebody that believes ardently that transgender people or gay people can change. Of course, the name Pray Away from the Pray Away the Gay.
Right.
I think people who ardently believe that probably would not find it as objective as what I'm saying. But it presented the individual stories, and it presented the story of the movement.
Right.
And it showed some things about the leadership of the movement and what the movement developed into.
Right.
So maybe for a minute we could tell what the movement was.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was sort of secondhand familiar with the ex-gay movement. My first boyfriend that I had met when I was a sophomore in college was very involved in Exodus International. And for years, he lived in one of their residency programs called Love in Action. Love in Action is sort of like a halfway house for people trying to no longer be gay. And they had, and I don't know why they had this in like San Francisco area. It seems a lot of the choices seem.
You go to the pond where the fish are.
I guess. A lot of the choices that were made in setting this up seem sort of built in to promote failure. But they would basically live in this house with maybe 8 to 12 other guys, all of whom were struggling with their sexual orientation.
Yeah.
And you had to agree to give them your paycheck.
Oh.
And so then they would.
I missed that part.
Well, this wasn't in the movie.
Oh,
this was some of the stuff that I'm familiar with in this ex-gay movement, and then the love in action. So you give them your paycheck, and they would give you an allowance, and you had to turn in receipts. And the main reason behind that was so that you weren't able to go out and buy porn, or you weren't able to go out and go to a bar or do something that would be kind of nefarious, I guess.
So this was really pre-internet emergence and all the free porn and other things that are available on the internet now. And so to get it, somebody would actually have to go to a store and buy magazines or something.
Right.
Yeah. So the movement had a number of components. You mentioned the halfway house type things. It also had groups and people who were in the program, whether they'd been forced into it, say, for example, by parents
or spouses. I had another friend who went through about 7 different types of programs over 20 years. He was married to his wife, and eventually it just became too damaging for him, and he left the straight lifestyle and sort of lives his authentic self and is much happier.
Yes. And so but one of the components that really I thought was just terrible. I mean, there are several things that I thought were terrible, but one of them was that people who were in the program were being asked to keep track of their sexual thoughts and ideas and actions. And so if somebody had lust in their heart, for example,
Right.
for somebody, then they had to report that.
Well, and you would
And,
strangely share them with one of the leaders and go into detail about your thoughts.
yes.
And I guess no one at the time thought this is very odd.
Well, yes,
But
to report anything like that, to report anything with that kind of detail and accountability to a leader, I'm not going there. It doesn't matter
Right.
what it is.
Yes, right. That's
And
cool.
but it just seems so strange that every time you have sexual thoughts, you're supposed to let this guy know.
Right. There would be notebooks and notebooks I would have given every week, but
Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah, greedy fellow. So anyway, I mean, that in itself is bad enough.
mhm.
So what happened was that over time, the movement became very prominent, and I think it tied in very well with the purity culture,
Right. Right.
and
And also
the
this
whole,
resurgence of religion getting involved in politics,
yes,
which was sort of and you had these big issues like abortion and homosexuality that
yeah,
Republicans took and sort of made then a way to control larger groups of people than, really having to kind of focus on other issues. So
yeah,
the start of the culture wars, maybe what I'm
yes,
trying to say.
yeah. And so it grew, and it grew rapidly. And there were, I don't know what you'd call them, but offshoots of the movement in various churches all over.
Right.
And so one of the key things to note is when I mentioned that people are talking to and sharing their behaviors or thoughts
Right.
with these
Leaders
leaders,
yeah. I like the air
counselors.
quote. Yes.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
most of them were not trained, right? They're not.
exactly.
They weren't
Yeah.
psychiatrists, psychologists. They didn't have any formal training, really much training at all.
Yes, and when I went through seminary, I took a basic counseling course,
Right.
and lesson one, day one,
Mhm.
is refer.
Yeah.
If it is something that is going to involve more than one or two visits to my office,
Okay.
I'm not qualified.
Right.
I don't have, and that's just a rule of thumb,
Right.
but I don't have counseling training. Now, I'm a nice person. I know a lot, just ask me. But
Yes.
yeah, I'll tell you. But so you have unqualified, untrained people who are uncertified
Mhm.
in any way, and they're engaging in approaches that they think are good and biblical. And there's a lot that goes on with that. So the movement kind of goes up and it has a crescendo,
Mhm.
and then something happens to a key leader. Was
Yeah, the key leader ends up getting drunk and walking into a bar. I think it was in Washington, D.C.
yeah,
And someone recognizes him because he was all over the media. He was on the talk shows. He was on the
yeah.
news. His face was everywhere. And they took photos of him leaving the bar.
And it was a gay bar.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So he got drunk and he went to
Yeah.
a gay bar and he got caught. And it
Yeah.
kind of really highlighted the flaws in the movement,
Yeah.
which you had all of these leaders who were there saying that things were different, and yet they still had the same sex attractions and they
Yeah.
were still struggling. And yet the lies that they were telling everyone was everything was fine, that they had changed. But
Yeah. Well, one of the things I've seen through my career, and I know I'm not qualified,
Yeah.
but I've noticed that some people enter into some type of education or counseling or advocacy role or field, really are just working out their own issues and inflicting their
Yeah.
own issues on other people.
Right. And I think
And
about that, especially in the context of one of the things that my friend had talked about that some of the counselors would do was there was this notion that people were gay because they didn't have healthy physical attractions towards other men or healthy physical interaction. So one of the things that they would do is they would practice healthy physical interactions with another man, which might be hugging, it might be touching, but in a way that was sort of deemed to be straight, and not gay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's a lot of fascinating things. But Terry, let me ask you though, from talking after the movie and
Yes.
then later on, that movie affected me, and I know it affected you. What was your kind of general takeaway when you walked out of there on that Saturday night? How are you
Yeah.
feeling?
Well, I was significantly triggered on a number of levels. And so as I sat there, um, I have PTSD,
Mhm.
and so I was physically trembling. And so at one point I slipped out to go to the restroom and come back, and I was able to sit in a stool behind the crowd.
Right.
And that gave me some space and some separation.
Mhm.
And of course, when you're struggling with something, that's it's something that may make you feel better, but it's also an indication that you may be isolating.
Okay.
And so at several points through it, you looked over and checked on me,
Mhm.
and I assured you that I was doing okay.
Right.
And but then Jennifer,
Mhm.
she got a stool and came up and sat next to me.
Right. She's one of our
And
straight allies. Who's
yeah,
who's on staff here at First Baptist. Is a huge
yeah,
help for
wonderful
all
lady.
of us. A really
Yeah,
great person.
yeah, we should clone
Love her.
her. Can we do an episode on cloning? We'll call it Cloning Jennifer.
There you go.
Yeah. So it was very traumatic for me, and I've thought quite a bit since then why it was so difficult.
Mhm.
And the first level on which it was traumatic for me was just looking at the practice and approach to ministry.
Okay.
I've been through school all the way up to my doctorate. I have 40 plus years of pastoral experience. I have preached to one, and I've preached to thousands. I mean, so
Right.
I've got a range.
Right. Right.
More often the one than the thousands. But anyway, so when I saw that approach to ministry, that really was disconcerting, with people who were not trained or qualified, groups, offshoots doing what they felt was right,
Mhm.
and being endorsed nationally without
Mhm.
nothing real solid to back it up.
Right.
Um,
And I think there
yeah,
was this notion that they thought they were doing good, and there was really zero consideration as to what the potential harm might be.
yeah, yeah,
And so I think, doctors, I don't know if ministers have this same sort of thing, but the fundamental thing is first, do no harm. I don't know
Yes.
if that's sort of a mantra of ministers, if that's one of the tenets, but it doesn't
No,
matter, do no harm, do whatever
yeah,
you need to do. Is
get
that
'em.
is that the kind of ministry you don't like?
Go out to the highways and the hedges and compel them,
Yes.
beat the tar out of them till they
Mhm.
come in.
Yep.
Yeah,
Okay.
compel.
Okay.
So another way that it was a challenge for me was ministerially.
Mhm.
I came up through college and seminary right at that time in the late 70s and early 80s,
Right.
when a very strong fundamentalist movement was sweeping across the country. And this
Right.
was a part of that, like you mentioned,
Okay.
the culture wars, politically, religiously. And I had a great desire to do a good job as a minister.
Mhm.
And so the model that we had set before us
Right.
was this kind of work where you're focused on the Bible and you're
Okay.
applying the Bible.
Mhm.
And the pastors of the big mega churches were saying,
Right.
well, if you do this that I did, you'll have a mega church too.
Okay.
Didn't work. I guess maybe I didn't pray enough. I
Yeah.
don't know.
So
But
Terry, more than that,
yeah,
more than
well,
just sort of as in this abstract
yeah, but that,
ministerial role,
yeah.
how did it impact you as a trans woman?
Okay. Well, but that affected me because for decades, I have carried shame and guilt
Mhm.
because I never did these things to gay people or
Right.
LGBT people, but I acquiesced to the movement,
Mhm.
and that was hard for me. As a person, I realized that nobody had done what they were doing to people to me.
Hmm.
I
Okay.
did it myself
Oh,
because the movement was so influential
right.
and it was so pervasive. I spent decades going through a
Mhm.
cycle of behavior, remorse, extreme guilt and shame,
Right.
and then praying and begging God to take this away from me.
And if I can interject here, I can fully relate to that because I sort of had my own little gay conversion therapy. I put
Mhm.
rubber bands around my wrist when I would have same-sex attraction. See,
Yeah.
a hot guy jogging around Furman's campus, I would be snapping those rubber bands. My wrists were like red. I had to switch to the other wrist. And at the end, when you pray and you pray and you pray and nothing happens,
Yeah.
how does that make you feel about what does that make you feel about your relationship with God?
I blame myself. I mean, there are a number of responses to that. Some people walk away from the church or from God.
Right.
But what we're taught in that kind of evangelical fundamentalist movement is that if it isn't working, it can't be God's fault.
Right. So you're just not praying
mine.
hard enough.
Right.
You're not reading the Bible enough. You're not
Yeah.
doing what you need to do.
Yes.
And I think that's where at the end it becomes so challenging, because
Yeah.
you sort of feel like, well, I've done everything I can.
Yeah.
So God must have abandoned me.
Yes. And so I got to a point where I was misusing substances. I was severely depressed. I was suicidal. I had a lot of problems going on. And it paired with other issues in my life at the time. And for me, it was literally a matter of life and death.
Wow.
And a chain of events happened that put me into some counseling with what I'll call secular counselors. They were respectful of my beliefs.
Right.
And my beliefs were a part of the equation because they were a part of me.
Right.
But the counselors helped me to understand and normalize and accept who I am. And one of my favorite passages is when God says to Moses, I am who I am. I'll be who I'll be. Let me alone. Quit trying to pigeonhole me, Moses.
Right.
And so people, I realized that pigeonholing and putting a derogatory label on myself wasn't helpful. And so one of the things that I notice is that labels for me were helpful when they helped me to find a way to express myself.
Right.
So I struggled with the label transgender for a long time, but I accepted it finally.
Right. What was the hesitation in that regard?
Well, by the time I was struggling with that label, I had already accepted that I was feminine.
Okay.
I had already accepted that I felt deep inside to my core like a woman, and I had already accepted that I could see indications of that throughout my life.
Okay.
So I looked at it, I thought, I'm very literal sometimes. I looked at it and I thought, trans means change. It means movement.
Okay.
And I argued I wasn't changing.
Right. You were just
I was
coming.
I was coming out.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I really struggled with that. But I learned that transgender is kind of an umbrella term. And it does come from that root in the is that Latin? I don't know. Greek. So Greek to me. My dad used to say, when in Rome? Yeah. So whatever's customary. So I finally came to understand that transgender meant a wide umbrella of people who were either gender nonconforming or fluid in their gender identity or moving from one point on the gender spectrum to another.
Right.
And it could be in our expression, it could be in our identity, it could be in our physicality in so many ways. And so I finally learned to accept that. So then when I come and I see a movie like this, and I see the pain that's going on in people's lives, and I equated it with the pain that I experienced at my own hands, not at theirs, but the same thing. And I just, it shook me to my core.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of my own shame and guilt that I'd inflicted on myself and on, I'd been a part of a movement indirectly that inflicted it on others. What, you said you had some responses.
Yeah, I don't know why it hit me so hard. And I think what really hit me so hard was this question of complicity, right? So I know a lot of churches, like, you said that you weren't involved in that specific movement. I know a lot of churches weren't involved in kind of the pray away the gay movement, but by not speaking out against it, by not stepping up, by not saying, no, this is dangerous theology, then these churches became complicit. And then I started to wonder, like, okay, was enough done at that time? And part of the reason that I have come back to my faith after, kind of leaving the Christian church for many, many years.
But I was here.
I knew you were here.
So you came back.
So I came back.
Okay.
Someone as smart as you is still.
And Brady.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't have enough time for all the superlatives I need to, whenever I speak to with you, Terry.
Yeah. Anyway, go ahead. So you came back.
So I came back, and that's why I want to be a part of a faith movement, because I feel like that there's almost the way that to affect change here in the South, I think, is to work through the churches. And I think that many churches need to sort of take a look at what they've done and recognize that, there's a lot of social problems that we have in this country: poverty, racism, income inequality, lack of access to food security, healthcare. But the churches,
a lot of groups just overlook that. You never
right. But I don't think that you can lay the blame for these issues at the door of the church.
No, but
I think you can. Yeah, but I think you can lay at the door of the church blame for LGBTQ stigma, LGBTQ suicide rate. I think that the churches created this situation in our nation where, they are responsible for the harm that has been done to LGBTQ people. And so I think churches have then an obligation to not only just sort of be welcoming, affirming, but to take active steps then to try and, push change in our society and push change. And healing. That's a great word. One of the reviews was talking about, and I think I mentioned this notion of the ex-leaders were looking for atonement. So I guess I kind of wonder, like, what would it look like for the church to atone for its sins and the way that it has marginalized and mistreated and abused LGBTQ people?
We cannot go back and trace everybody that we've injured.
Right.
And the 12-step movement I'm in, I mentioned that I use substances as a part of my response. We make amends, and an amend is after you've identified how you've hurt somebody.
Right.
You try to see, how can I correct it?
Right. What
can I do? I can't undo it, but is there something I can do to acknowledge it, to own it? It's not really about apologizing, but what can I do to correct it?
Sure.
And a lot of times we have what we call a living amends, because perhaps the person that we've hurt has already passed away, or we don't know where they are, or it would be injurious in their life in some way to enter back in. And so we do a living amends by changing the way we live. And by reversing that behavior, and in a sense, helping others. And that's what the church could do. The church cannot track down all the LGBT people that she has injured.
Right.
And it would be dangerous for many of them if she did.
Right.
But through programming, through preaching, through theology, through education, through a lot of ways. I'm interested that you see the church in the South as so influential when a lot of people in our culture think the church is become irrelevant.
Well, I find that very, and I think that a lot of people do find the church irrelevant. Because, and that's why you have a lot of younger people who aren't going to church as much anymore, and who aren't joining the church. So I think on sort of a broader societal level, maybe some people are finding the church irrelevant. But what is really driving a lot of the politics, and what's driving a lot of the kind of beliefs that people have, is coming from the churches here, and the churches still have a lot of power. And I think you've had a shift away from the denominational churches, but you have the non-denominational churches that are really gaining a lot of power.
And they are typically, I'm generalizing, my own subjective observation. I don't have statistics or anything, but it appears that they typically follow that same evangelical mode. that focuses on coming to Jesus, bringing people to Jesus.
Right.
And then if you'll just do that and read your Bible and do what it says, you'll be fine.
Okay.
And if, if you'd read your Bible and do what it says, then a man and a woman would marry one another and it would work.
Well, that would be nice, wouldn't it?
Yes.
If it were that simple for folks.
Yes, of course.
But let me
yeah.
sort of follow up a little bit on the point I was making. I think it's that a lot of people are not losing spirituality or not losing faith. I think faith probably is still very important to people. I think the studies bear that out, but I think they're losing faith in organized religion.
Yes.
And a big part of that is because the way that they see the church has promoted racism and promoted homophobia, and then also that the church continues to do that and to ignore a lot of the big social justice problems in this society that I think they probably feel the churches should be tackling.
Yes, and there's also a disconnect in a lot of cases between the church's dogma or doctrine or teachings and the beliefs of individual members.
Right.
And so they'll say, well, the church says this, but
right.
And that's pretty common as well.
So I think we've sort of solved the church's problems. We're circling back around.
Okay.
Let's sort of conclude our look at the Netflix documentary Pray Away.
Yeah.
Would you recommend to someone that they see this documentary, and who would you recommend see it in? Is there some group that you would say, no, maybe it's not quite right?
Bottom line, yes, I would recommend it. But I would put some caveats in.
Right.
Because it can be so triggering. I think anybody that is recovering from trauma that they've experienced at the hands of the church, or sexual trauma or anything like that, might want to ensure that maybe they have somebody with them to watch it,
or a plan maybe for afterwards.
Yeah, and some aftercare.
Yeah.
Some aftercare. And I think that people who would gain from it are people who are willing to come into it with a clean piece of paper and take a look at it and think it through and not come in with the yes, but.
Okay.
One of the key things was when the leader of the movement was confronted after he recanted.
Right.
But that didn't erase his guilt.
Right.
And people were very hurt and they wanted him to know that.
Right.
Yeah.
For me, in the end, I would probably not recommend the movie, actually. And the reason is that it showed, I think, too narrow a perspective on this. Because the ex gays, the people who were ex-gay in the movement, and they realized, their sexual orientation had not changed as a result of all of this conversion therapy. They were showing the leaders of these groups, and I felt like they were all very, necessarily contrite. Like they had really harmed a lot of people, and they needed, when they were being interviewed, to sort of have that remorse and show that remorse. But I didn't think you saw a lot of ex-gays sort of living a happy, life like most of us are. There was a time when I thought that I had been cured of homosexuality, and I would praise God for that, and I was ready to be like a disciple for that and help other people pray away the gay.
Be the poster child.
Yeah, but it was temporary. And then, there wasn't, at the end of the day, I felt like there was no joy that we saw from anyone in that movie. And I think that for me was a little bit of a difficult message. And so that for me is why I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But sort of final thoughts, and then we ought to wrap up this week's exciting discussion on Pray Away.
I think my final thought would be that we often think of God as the creator. And we think of creation as something that happened. And we read the accounts, and whether you look at the Bible or other things. But creation, it's part of who God is.
Right.
And so God is creative. Creation is still happening.
Yeah. I'm doing a Bible study on the sacraments. That is going to be this week, sort of next week, and we're looking at them generally. One of the sacraments that people were considering, back in the first millennia of Christianity, was creation as a sacrament. And sort of this notion that we're all involved and have a part in creation, And that is a sacrament, that is an act of something sacred
Yeah.
that, sort of reveals something about the divine to us. So I think that
Yeah.
notion of creation has a lot of, your belief has a lot of history in the Christian church.
Yeah. Well, and so because God is creative and we are creative, we can accept the development of our self-understanding. We can understand that kind of growth and we can embrace it.
Right.
And the most important thing I think I could say is embrace yourself.
Right.
Whoever you are, whether you're believe that being LGBTQ is can find a remedy or it's a sin, or whether you are LGBTQ and you're afraid, embrace yourself. I give the best me hugs.
Thanks so much, Terry. As always,
Yeah.
I've enjoyed our chat thoroughly.
That was me you embraced, not yourself, by the way.
See this Zoom thing?
It's got
the
it
mirrored
reversed.
mode,
Yeah.
reverse. I don't know who's what. I
You
thought
get
I was
all
over there.
concerned. Yeah.
That's just confusing. All right.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm Brian.
I'm Terry.
Have a great week.
Bye-bye.